everyone. Namaste. Welcome back to Anthropause. I'm Simone.
I'm Sitashma, and thank you for joining us for our seventh episode, The Carbon Negative Kingdom.
Recently, you might have heard the phrase going net zero a lot in the media. China announced reaching net zero by 2060. Countries like France, New Zealand, and the UK have promised to go net zero by 2050. Also have been references to going carbon neutral and carbon negative. So, to begin our episode, let's be clear on what these terms mean.
So firstly, the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, defines net zero carbon dioxide emissions as being achieved when carbon dioxide emissions are balanced globally by carbon dioxide removals over a specified period. Net zero carbon dioxide emissions are also referred to as carbon neutrality. In simpler words, this means that carbon dioxide emissions are still being generated, but they are offset elsewhere.
Another term that should be defined is carbon negative. Carbon negative is a concept that takes carbon neutrality a step further. It means removing or sequestering more carbon dioxide than that is emitted. We'll learn more about this term from our guest today, who's joining us all the way from Bhutan.
The Kingdom of Bhutan is a landlocked country in the eastern Himalayas bordered by China and India, with a population of approximately 763,000 people. Bhutan has surpassed all nations and become the first carbon negative country in the world. It is also a country that believes in measuring progress using the Gross National Happiness (GNH) indicator instead of the usual Gross Domestic Product (GDP).
To talk about Bhutan's achievements, challenges, and commitment towards a more holistic development, we have Mr. Sangay Dorji, who is currently the National Energy and Environmental Expert at Undp Bhutan.
He has been in the field of environment for 22 years. He did his undergrad in environmental engineering from Thailand in the late 90s, and then he started working with the government of Bhutan since 2007. Then he got his master's in environmental management from UNSW Australia. And after that, he returned to Bhutan and worked with the mega hydropower project looking at its environmental and social safeguards for 5 years. And after all of this, he set up a consulting firm working on climate change, energy, and environmental issues in Bhutan, with some projects in India as well. In the near future, Mr. Dorji will be working in developing Bhutan's long-term low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development strategy.
Hello, Mr. Dorji. Welcome to the show. We're looking forward to our conversation with you today.
Thank you, Simone and Sitashma. Good to be on the show. Good to see you guys fresh and lively even at this late an hour in the place where you are.
So we would like to start this episode by asking you what the gross national happiness philosophy is and if it correlates with Bhutan's carbon negative achievement.
Right, thank you. I think you pretty much know, besides hydropower and tourism, I think probably gross national happiness is Bhutan's biggest export to the rest of the world. But when I say export, this is not an export earn revenue, but this is a social export, a concept that was conceived in Bhutan, expounded by His Majesty, the fourth King of Bhutan. And now this has grown recognition world over as a more balanced approach to development. So the gross national happiness is not really, it doesn't dictate how much of an economy you want to grow, but it is a philosophy towards development. Bhutan has been on following the philosophy of gross national happiness since I think while the philosophy was there since the 1970s, it was more towards the 1990s and 2000s that Bhutan took a conscious effort in expounding the philosophy of gross national happiness, developing indicators to measure these gross national happiness. So gross national happiness is dependent on 4 pillars, which are good governance, balanced socioeconomic development, social and cultural conservation and preservation, and environment conservation and enhancement. So the entire basis of this is that human happiness is dependent on factors other than just economic development. So this is to say that Bhutan does not measure its development pace, development successes with just GDP and GDP per capita indices, but we measure how we have been able to increase the combined happiness of our citizenry. And I think so far we've been doing quite well. Um, I think it was a few years ago that even the United Nations adopted a day in the year as the World Happiness Day. So Bhutan has been quite successful in exporting the concept of gross national happiness. And there are similar concepts in other places in the world as well, where you, instead of measuring development, you measure progress as a subset of human happiness. So I think unless there are pointed questions, I'll leave it at that because people might get too bored with the philosophical talk on GNH.
Yeah, thank you for summarizing the philosophy very well. But I wanted to ask you, how has this correlated with Bhutan's carbon negative achievement?
Correct. Thank you. I got too engrossed in GNH and forgot the carbon neutrality and environment conservation. As I said earlier, one of the pillars of gross national happiness is environment conservation, right? And Bhutan, while the rest of the world was on a rapid goal towards increasing GDP through using the natural capital base, Bhutan has been using the concept of gross national happiness and through conscious choices have been preserving forests. We have not gone on a uncontrolled logging spree. In fact, our forest cover, instead of decreasing, has been increasing over the years. We have a unique constitution drafted sometime in 2000, adopted sometime in 2008, which talks about maintaining a minimum of 60% forest cover for all times to come. And now, at the moment, I'm happy to report that the last forest inventory showed that we have 70.77% forest cover. So that is more than 10% of the constitutional mandate of forest cover. Not only just on forest cover as a factor influencing environment, but look at tourism. Tourism has a definite impact on environment, and Bhutan has adopted the conscious choice of low volume, high value tourism. We still do not have mass tourism. If you look at industry, manufacturing industries, there also we have taken very, very slow steps. While we had the first manufacturing industries only starting to operate in Bhutan in the early 80s. So in all areas of development, particularly related to environment, Bhutan has been taking very, very childish, steady steps to ensure that we do not harm and jeopardize the fragile balance in our mountain ecosystem.
You definitely touched some topics that we will be talking about. We will be asking you about. So the second question for you is, Bhutan's journey of achieving carbon formally began during the 15th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen in 2009. So here, member countries committed to remaining carbon neutral, including the Kingdom of Bhutan. However, Bhutan did not just achieve carbon neutrality, but also became the first carbon negative country in the world. So how did Bhutan make this happen?
When we made the carbon neutrality pledge in 2019, this was a conscious effort. And we really didn't have much to do back then because we were already carbon negative when we made that pledge. The pledge was more towards Bhutan going through and keeping status quo, or rather improving on carbon neutral, being carbon neutral. We, at a government level, Bhutan, the authorities were aware that in order to avoid catastrophic climate change impacts, the world has to reduce GHG emissions. And as per the IPCC reports, which was recently released, there, a lot has to be done. And Bhutan was aware of uh, the enormous responsibilities facing the world of nations, the citizens, the global citizens, to say. And we were aware, and we made that pledge. I mean, we could have stayed without making that pledge and looked at how best to develop uh, from an LDC to a developing country status. But carbon neutrality was thought to be really important, and that statement was made. Since then, I think our forest cover increased by about 2 to 3%, and as a result, carbon sequestration has been increasing over the years. I mean, we still need to be conscious that our emissions are also increasing, but the last GHG inventory done was for the year 2015, in which we had, I think, about 3,800 gigagrams of emissions against 9,400 gigagrams of sequestration. So we were still net negative, carbon negative country by almost 6,200 gigagrams, or 6.2 million tons of CO2 equivalent.
It is really impressive how Bhutan was already carbon neutral even before pledging to go carbon neutral. However, like on media today, carbon neutrality or net zero or any other sustainable initiative is often paired with wealthy countries, right? So, however, major emitters such as the G20 countries generate 80% of the total CO2 emissions. So, what do you think is the role of small nations like Bhutan in combating climate change?
I would take you to the Buddhist narrative of adding a drop of water into the ocean, right? So if you add a drop of water into the ocean, your water droplet remains a part of that ocean unless the ocean dries up. So the action of Bhutan on climate change, I mean, if you look at the whole wide scale of things, the 6.8 million tons of CO2 at a global scale is nothing. But what little Bhutan is doing, has done, is showed the world that it is not just feasible to develop the way we have done, following a business as usual scenario. We need to change and change fast, because climate change is an urgent threat, not only just to like people of the LDCs like us who have very little capability to adapt. But if you look at now news, you have bushfires happening in California, you have bushfires in Australia, you have big floods, you have so many so many disasters happening around us, which can be directly or indirectly attributed to climate change. And what Little Bhutan has done is a need to provide social services to the citizenry. There is also a more important, a more urgent need to address the issues of climate change. And this is what we have done over the years.
You talked about it earlier as well. Bhutan is the only country in the world that talks about forest protection in its constitution. So why do you think this clause is important to have in the constitution? And how has Bhutan maintained its forest percentage and its carbon negative status?
I think the entire environmental conservation, of course, while it comes from Buddhist values, I would like to attribute His Majesty the Fourth King of Bhutan is the father of environment conservation in Bhutan. He took conscious decisions on development related to environment, while during his reign in the early 70s and 80s, climate change was really not a big issue. But he had the foresight to know that use of natural resources, unsustainable use of natural resources could lead to catastrophes. We had more than, by then we had about 65% forest cover. And one approach towards development could have been, you could have started a commercial logging industry, would have made high-end furniture exported to Europe. But logging was one area where he put a full stop, and a state enterprise was created, which was in charge of harvesting forest products. And they had very strict guidelines on how to do forest harvest in a sustainable manner. So, in essence, he actually looked at environment as a way of enhancing happiness. And in 2008, when the constitution was adopted, you remember we were moving from an area of absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy against the will of the people, that also. So when the constitution was being drafted, the drafting committee and His Majesty King had the wisdom that not every government that comes to power may have will have the same regard towards the environment, towards the general well-being. We might have a government that might be, move towards a more economic development approach. So that is why safeguards such as the forest cover, the need to be climate resilient, um, and making every citizen of Bhutan a custodian of the environment. These were consciously adopted and put in the constitution. So since then, I mean, now we already have the guiding documents, the philosophies in place. We just need to now take steps forward in using these philosophies and guidance.
Now, talking about maintaining certain forest cover, experts have demonstrated how reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation programs, or the REDD plus programs, could significantly reduce CO2 emissions and prevent biodiversity loss. However, it is not without its problem and is often associated with increasing land conflict, especially in areas where land rules are already weak, even like loss of biodiversity as it may promote monoculture, and also the exclusion of community members. So, how has REDD Plus been implemented in Bhutan, and have there been any challenges regarding this program?
Well, I agree with you, Simon, on the Red Plus. While I mean, Red Plus has its inherent benefits when it comes to changing development habits in certain countries, like in the Amazon rainforest. So the whole concept of this is if you're already deforesting quite a bit of your forest land, then you stop that practice and then you get rewarded, right? That's a results-based payment. If you have a deforested stretch in your country, you carry out afforestation and you get paid. So, in a sense, what Red Plus does is it essentially rewards you from changing from bad to good. For a country like Bhutan, we are already good. So, there is no reward at the end of the day for doing what we already do. So, I mean, we did have Red Plus projects happening, capacity building, doing the baselines, the national forest inventories, and then we also have a Red Plus strategy currently being developed, which looks at now how do we improve forest management practices to ensure that forest emissions decreases and sinks increase. But overall, this is just my personal view. I don't think Bhutan can stand to benefit really significantly from Red Plus because it inherently rewards bad behavior and it doesn't really recognize what we already have. I mean, the forest cover that we have goes way back to the early 1960s and conservation efforts from the 1950s and 60s. And we don't have the baseline where we say our country is only 20% forested. We want to increase it to 60% and get paid for that. But for areas where, I mean, I've been on the Red Plus review team of the Untitled for a while now, and we did look at the unintended impacts of monoculture, the land conflicts, as you said, because Red Plus would need areas to be reforested, and areas that generally, in some areas, these belong to marginalized communities, and they depend on this land for their livelihoods. But in Bhutan, the case is almost all our forest area is essentially state forest land. So it doesn't belong to private persons or communities. Communities have their own patches of land for cultivation and other economic activities. So this question doesn't really apply. But in a nutshell, Red Plus as a good strategy going forward to stop bad behavior, stop an etiquette from damaging the reputation of the entire school. But it doesn't really encourage a good student to perform exceedingly well.
So, while Bhutan's forests do act as major carbon sinks, we would love to know what are other things Bhutan is doing to help greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. Thank you, Sitashma. So we made the carbon neutrality pledge in way back in 2009. In 2015, this was again reiterated. Right. So 2015 Conference of Parties in Copenhagen. That was one of our key again inputs to the dialogues where we reiterated our carbon neutrality pledge. And since then, the Bhutanese government, we have had two governments since then, has taken steps, baby steps, beginning looking at assessments, doing GHG inventories, seeing how we can reduce emissions. So on the one hand, we have the carbon sink, which is forest, soil carbon in the forest, carbon above ground, carbon underground, carbon stocks. But more important than that, we also have a development, imperative developments happening in Bhutan. Um, if you look at the GHG, the greenhouse gas inventory of the Kingdom of Bhutan, agriculture emissions historically used to be the highest in Bhutan. So if you look at the initial national communication looking at 1994, agriculture was one of the highest emitting sectors. But if you look at the 2010 and 2015 data, agriculture emissions have remained the same, almost the same, on a straight line pathway, which indicates that agriculture emissions in Bhutan was a livelihood emission, a lifeline emission, a subsistence farming emission. So there is not really much scope in reducing emissions from agriculture. But two key sectors come out. One is energy, and the other one is industrial processes, IPPU, industrial processes and product use. If you look at the energy emissions and look at the breakdown of emissions, electricity, while globally is one of the highest emitting categories, in Bhutan it is not so because Bhutan relies 100% on renewable hydro, wind, and solar for electricity. But our transport sector, knowing that we live in a mountainous country, very difficult topography and terrain, very difficult to introduce mass transport, such as LRTs. And then we have the constraint of space for introducing BRTs and all this. And as a result, if you look at emissions from the use of fossil fuels in transport, private cars, taxis, buses, and freight transport has been increasing rapidly since 1994 to the point where now it is it's the second highest emitting sector in the country. We had manufacturing industries. And the emissions there has also been growing. Projections indicate that manufacturing industry and transport together by 2030 will account for about 60% of the national emissions. So these are the two areas where we have deep concerns. To respond to that, the government has carried out since 2016 developed strategies such as the low emission development strategy for surface transport and the low emission development strategy for industry. There's also a low emission development strategy done for the human settlement sector, which looks at how we can reduce energy consumption, fossil consumption at residential, commercial, and institutional levels. And we also developed a low emission development strategy for the food security sector. So ensuring that even though there might be opportunities for commercial farming in the years to come, we adopt a low emission development pathway even in there. So in response to carbon GHG emissions from these sectors, there are strategies being developed. These have been clearly indicated in the second nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC, wherein Bhutan said, look, we stand ready to take these actions to mitigate and reduce GHG emissions from our sectors. But the key word there is we need to be supported. Supported not in just in terms of giving us money to invest, but also giving us access to technology, helping build our capacities. So we are looking at least reducing GHG emissions by 12% from the BAU scenario by 2035 if the activities identified in the second NDC do get supported and implemented.
You have set the tone for our next question. Like you mentioned, agriculture is one of the significant contributors to greenhouse gases. Bhutan has pushed its goal of becoming food self sufficient while also achieving to be the world's first 100% organic nation by 2035. What does this mean, and what are its challenges, and how does Bhutan plan to do so?
Even without bringing in the climate angle, the goal, the objective of going organic comes more from the point of nutrition for our citizens and the impacts of, the impacts of the use of agriculture chemicals and inputs, artificial inputs into into agriculture production, and related health impacts such as, there you read about growing instances of cancer patients in areas where too much of chemical fertilizers are used. Um, Bhutan has been taking that has taken that approach. Now we have a national organic agriculture flagship program being taken up by the Ministry of Agriculture. Um, Even without these initiatives, uh, a general thumb rule, the agriculture practice in Bhutan is already organic. I would actually rate it as organic because the we did a study earlier where we found out that the maximum chemical input, and when we talk about chemicals here, we're not really talking about really heavy pesticides, weedicides, and chemicals. We're talking more about addition of N fertilizers, urea, into bad, poor soils to increase plant nutrition. So, and even the rate of application of urea in Bhutan is really low. So, we could probably say that agriculture as practice is already organic. But going beyond that, the aim is now even to reduce application of artificial N fertilizers and adopt a more organic, farm-based, uh, compost-based, biomass-based farming system. So for Bhutan, we do have the goals of food security, but we are also faced with constraints of land, right? We live in a mountainous country. Um, Many of the agriculture areas be above 2,000 meters above sea level, cold temperate zones. So crop productivity is very low. Um, the Out of the 38,394 square kilometers of the country area, I think only about 2.5% is suitable for agriculture. So we faced with these constraints and then the difficulties of taking water through irrigation to isolated farming communities. These are all challenges that we have to contend with. And while food security is a goal, a national goal, I think at a personal level, I would have very high reservations on achieving food security in the immediate future, going organic. But I think the with the relations that we have with our neighboring countries, as well as the openness of the global trade programs, I think we should focus more on areas where we are more productive than cultivation and try to supplement. We are only producing about 70% of the food we eat, 30% is imported already. And if there is a comparative advantage for Bhutan to do something else, conserve whatever little forest area there is available in the world for biodiversity, for as a carbon sink, and look at more tropical, subtropical areas for food production and import those food for our consumption. That would, I think, bring a better balance into the carbon equation as well.
Um, so clearly, the road to great achievement is often met with challenges as well. Like you mentioned, Bhutan is like a mountainous country, and crop productivity is low due to the cold climate. So even when it comes to climate change, as like exemplary as Bhutan's sustainability performance is, the country is still vulnerable to effects of climate change. So what do you think are the greatest risks that climate change poses to Bhutan and its people?
We are currently in the process of doing the national adaptation plan to be submitted to the UNFCCC. We have already implemented 3 rounds of NAPA projects, so National Adaptation Plan of Program of Action. We are on NAPA 3 now, which looks at addressing critical risks to vulnerable areas. One, as a mountainous country, uh, one of the greatest risks comes from extreme weather, right? So we tend to have earlier, I mean, during our childhood years, our monsoon period stretches from probably towards midway all the way towards September. But now I mean, just observing weather patterns now, May is a dry month in Bhutan now. We get some rain in June, but July, August, we get intense rainfall. So if you look at the weather data, our rainfall, actually the volume of rainfall that we receive during the monsoon has increased, but the period in which we receive that rainfall has decreased. So we get it within 2 short months of mostly July and August. As a result, we have severe landslides. We have flash floods. Uh, just last week, in a town in eastern Bhutan, a flash flood in a small rivulet that was not even a stream, it was a small rivulet, a tributary to one of the biggest rivers in Bhutan, had a flash flood. That rivulet runs right in the middle of the town, and it cost us 3 precious lives of high school students. We have had incidences of such flash floods, which took away 6 lives a couple of years ago. Then the other risk we have is from the glacial lake outburst floods. Our mountain river systems are fed by glacial lakes. Because of climate change, the volume of water in the glacial lakes have been increasing. And we have had one GLOF in 1994, which cost us a lot of lives and destruction and properties. And we have tried to address these through artificial lowering of lakes, installation of early warning systems, stabilizing slopes where there are imminent risk of slope failure. But these are just not enough. We do not have the technical capacity nor the financial resources to address all challenges. But we are hopeful that through the climate finance windows, and now recently there's been more focus on financing adaptation equally with mitigation, we might be able to access these climate finance windows and take a more robust approach towards adapting to climate change.
Slightly moving away from this topic now, in our conversation today, you touched upon Bhutan's tourism industry and its policy of high value, low impact.
I'm no expert in tourism, right? So that's a disclaimer. But if you look at the way tourism has been conceived in Bhutan, we could have gone with bring in the maximum number of tourists into the country. That essentially means you create a very vibrant hospitality industry. So a lot more number of hotels will come up. We might even have 7-star hotels, but you might even have these are hostels for backpackers. So the hospitality industry that is very vibrant, that would contribute to the Bhutanese economy. We would have more tourism companies engaged in tourism. We have this could have also enhanced the handicraft sector. So traditional arts and crafts would have improved, and because as more people, number of people come in, there's an inherent demand for indigenous arts and crafts. But there is also a risk for a country with a population of less than 800,000 people. If you have more than 100,000 people coming in, what would happen to your own culture? What would happen to the way your children see their future? And then you have 100,000 people going into your pristine forest. What would happen to the fine balance in your ecology in the fragile mountain ecosystem? So these decisions were taken while the high value, low volume policy was adopted. It essentially looked at the what is the key objective of tourism industry. If the key objective of tourism industry is to get the much needed national revenue to finance social sectors in the country, then we could do it through mass tourism, get many people coming in, but that might do a disservice to the other sectors as well. But we could still get that same revenue in by putting a premium on tourism in Bhutan. So a tourist coming into Bhutan pays about $250 a day, of which I think $65 goes as sustainable development fee. That goes to the government exchequer. The balance stays with the private tour operator to meet the cost of the tour and his profit margins as well. So this is basically a win-win situation where, I mean, you add 1,000 cars to our roads to cater to the tourism sector, then we are going to have bad traffic jams, as we are already seeing now in the capital city of Thimphu. It's not, not uh, not normal to not get stuck for 5 to 10 minutes when you're moving towards town, which was hardly seen in 5, 6 years ago. But if you have mass tourism, then you can imagine what additional problems that could create. So these high value, low volume tourism idea was conceived of at the right time. We have reaped the benefits of tourism. We've had tourists with ethics, tourists with a sense of their responsibility towards environment coming, and we have reaped the benefits. And I think going forward, this is exactly what we want to do now. Um, Recently, there is an ecotourism project signed between the government of Bhutan and I think it's the Global Environment Facility, which looks at now nature-based tourism, promoting nature-based tourism, rural tourism, where the community becomes custodians and operators of tours as well.
So, as we come to the end of our episode, we would like to ask you a very important question, Mr. Dorji. So, you know how we talked about the recent IPCC report? It clearly stated with high confidence that global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2030 and 2052 if it continues to increase at the current rate. So therefore, it has become imperative and urgent, like you said earlier, for many countries to achieve their net zero goals as they've stated in their climate goals. So what advice would you give other countries around the world in their journey to carbon neutrality or net zero?
From a small, least developed country in the Himalayas, I would send out my request to fellow citizens of vulnerable countries to hang in there, take as more action as possible, but believe in the goodness of human spirit and believe that our compatriots in the developed world are also equally concerned and we are in this boat together. I mean, climate change is real. The threat from climate change and the dangers of dangerous climate change are real. We are faced with that. And we just have to believe that the whole entire world, not just developed or developing countries, we are all in the same boat and we face the same consequences. Only our ability to respond to these threats are different. But that doesn't matter in the long run because if the boat doesn't matter whether you're in the upper deck or the lower deck, you all sink together. Having said that, my sincere hope and expectation is that concrete steps will be taken in the forthcoming COP towards the end of this year in Glasgow, where nations leave behind their safeguards on national economies and a little bit of selfish reservations and look forward to a more robust climate action, um, accelerate the race towards net zero, not just leave things till 2050, but if you can achieve them by 2030, 2035, why would you want to delay it till 2050? Provide the required support for people like us, countries like us, where we need the support not only to mitigate, but also adapt to climate change, and practically pray that we all get together, we all get to the end goal of doing away with dangerous climate change risks.
Thank you so much. That was a very powerful message and a very good message to end this episode on. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I think this was a great conversation and I learned a lot. And I'm sure that our listeners will learn a lot from this episode too. So thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Dorji.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Have a good day, ladies.
Thank you for listening to our episode. You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, and other platforms. You can also find us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Links to these platforms will be in the description box.
We will also be attaching reference links in the description box. See you next month.